She thought she buried her husband after a tragic accident, but just 48 hours later, she saw him standing alive in court, accused of masterminding one of the most shocking love scams India had ever seen. In the vibrant city of Pune, 25-year-old Ananya Mehta was known for her grace and intelligence. She worked as a graphic designer for a local firm and lived a quiet, content life surrounded by friends and family who admired her steady nature. A year earlier, she had married Raghav Sharma, a confident and charming man who ran a small import business. Their meeting had seemed like fate, a chance encounter at a mutual friend's wedding that quickly turned into an intense courtship. Raghav was everything Ananya had dreamed of: attentive, ambitious, and endlessly caring. Together, they built a life that looked flawless from the outside. Their home was filled with laughter, framed photos, and promises whispered in moments of peace. On social media, they appeared inseparable, the kind of couple people secretly envied. But beneath the surface, small things began to unsettle Ananya. Raghav often came home late, smelling of cigarette smoke, though he had promised he'd quit. He spent long hours on phone calls that he brushed off as business matters. Once, she found foreign currency in his drawer and assumed it was related to work. When she asked, he smiled and changed the subject. Ananya wanted to believe that love meant trust, that marriage meant faith. She convinced herself not to pry, fearing she might seem suspicious or controlling. Even as her instincts whispered that something was wrong, she silenced them. To her, Raghav was still the man who had once held her hand under the rain and said he would never leave her side. In her heart, she believed in their story, a young couple building dreams together, unaware that those dreams were about to crumble in the most unthinkable way. The evening began like any other, with rain drizzling softly against the windows and the faint hum of traffic outside. Ananya waited for Raghav to return from a business meeting in Mumbai, glancing at her phone every few minutes. He had promised to be home by dinner, but as hours passed, her worry grew heavier. At midnight, her phone rang. It was the police. They informed her that Raghav's car had been found crashed along a deserted stretch of the Mumbai-Pune highway. The vehicle was overturned, its front crushed, and the driver's body burned beyond easy recognition. They needed someone to confirm his identity. Trembling, Ananya rushed to the morgue with her brother. The air there was thick with disinfectant and silence. When the sheet was lifted, she collapsed at the sight. The ring on the charred hand was unmistakably Raghav's. She signed the papers, her vision blurred with tears. The following day, the funeral was held. Relatives gathered, whispering condolences as priests chanted prayers. The scent of incense mixed with the salt of her tears. Ananya felt as if her body was moving on its own, performing rituals she barely understood. She kept expecting Raghav to walk in, flashing his familiar smile, telling her it was all a mistake. But the flames at the cremation site made it real. When the ashes were collected and buried, a haunting emptiness settled inside her. Friends tried to console her, reminding her of faith and destiny, but their words floated past her unheard. For days, she stayed locked in her room, clutching his photograph, unable to sleep or eat. Her husband was gone, her future erased in one stormy night. She believed the tragedy was fate's cruel hand, never suspecting it was carefully planned deception. 2 days after the funeral, the Mehta house was filled with the quiet murmur of visitors offering condolences. The air was heavy with incense and sorrow, and Ananya sat motionless in a corner, her face pale from sleepless nights. Friends brought food she couldn't eat, and relatives spoke softly about moving forward, but her mind was trapped in the past. Among the steady flow of guests came a police inspector named Vikram Rao, a man in his 40s with sharp eyes and a calm voice. Unlike the others, he didn't speak of loss or faith. Instead, he asked strange, pointed questions about Raghav's business, his clients, and his recent travel history. He wanted to know if Raghav had ever mentioned foreign contacts or financial troubles. His tone made Ananya uneasy, but she answered as best as she could, insisting that her husband had always been responsible and honest. That evening, after everyone left, Ananya tried to rest, but couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The inspector's visit had planted doubt in her grieving heart. Just before midnight, a soft rustling outside her door drew her attention. When she opened it, she found an envelope lying on the floor. Inside was a neatly folded paper, a court summons addressed to Raghav Sharma. The document ordered him to appear in court within 48 hours for a fraud hearing related to a business deal in Delhi. Her heart raced. It made no sense. Her husband had been dead for days, and she had buried his ashes with her own hands. Believing it was an administrative error, she decided to visit the courthouse the next morning to clear up the confusion. She didn't realize she was about to uncover the most shocking truth of her life. The next morning, Ananya arrived at the district courthouse, her hands trembling as she clutched the mysterious summons. She hoped it was a mistake, some bureaucratic mix-up that would be cleared in minutes. The courthouse was crowded and noisy, filled with lawyers, clerks, and anxious citizens. She followed the directions written on the paper and entered courtroom 3, her heart pounding in her chest. The hearing was already in progress. As she looked toward the front, her eyes froze on a figure standing before the judge. For a moment, her mind refused to believe what it was seeing. It was Raghav, alive, breathing, and very real. The same face, the same build, even the small scar on his chin she had once kissed. Her pulse quickened as her breath caught in her throat. The world around her blurred. She felt dizzy, gripping the bench to steady herself. The man was being questioned about financial fraud and identity theft, his voice calm and steady as he denied the charges. Every word echoed in her ears. How could this be possible? She had identified his body, performed his last rites, and watched the flames consume him. Yet here he was, dressed in a formal shirt, answering to a name she had mourned. When she tried to approach, an officer stopped her, mistaking her panic for disruption. The judge ordered Raghav's custody for further investigation, and in that moment, he turned slightly. Their eyes met. For a fleeting second, there was no shock on his face, only recognition. It was as if he knew she would come. Ananya's legs gave way as realization struck her like lightning. The man she had buried wasn't her husband. The real Raghav Sharma had faked his death and fooled everyone. News of Raghav's sudden reappearance spread like wildfire, leaving everyone who had attended his funeral in disbelief. The police launched a full-scale investigation, determined to uncover how a man declared dead could stand alive in court. Within days, investigators pieced together a disturbing trail of deception. Raghav's import business, once admired for its apparent success, was nothing more than a front for a network of fraudulent transactions. He had been working with international scammers, laundering money through fake shipping companies and bogus accounts. When authorities began closing in, he decided to vanish before they could arrest him. Investigators discovered that the night of the accident was the final stage of his plan. He had bribed a morgue attendant to help him switch bodies, replacing his own identity with that of a dead man who resembled him. The stolen corpse belonged to an unidentified victim from a separate car crash that same evening. Raghav then planted his personal items in the wrecked vehicle, including his wallet, watch, and ring, ensuring the body would be identified as his. The forged dental records completed the illusion. After the supposed cremation, Raghav quietly disappeared under a new name, intending to escape to Singapore with millions in stolen funds. But fate turned against him. During an unrelated fraud case, his alias surfaced when one of his associates was arrested, leading investigators straight to him. By the time Raghav realized his cover was blown, it was too late. His carefully constructed plan, the fake death, the swapped body, the emotional manipulation, unraveled within hours. For Ananya, the revelation was unbearable. Every tender memory she once cherished became a piece of a larger lie. The man she had mourned was not a victim of tragedy, but the architect of his own disappearance. When investigators reopened the case, their first step was to exhume the grave where Raghav's ashes had been buried. The results shattered what little peace remained in Ananya's life. DNA testing confirmed the truth. The body she had cremated did not belong to her husband. It was identified as that of a missing construction worker from Mumbai named Mahesh Patil, who had vanished the same night as Raghav's supposed accident. Police believed Raghav had discovered Mahesh's body at the crash site and used it as part of his elaborate escape plan. He had paid a corrupt morgue attendant to alter records, switch tags, and ensure the body would be labeled as his. The deception was flawless, so convincing that even Ananya, who knew every detail of her husband's appearance, could not question what she saw in her grief. The revelation caused a nationwide stir. Media outlets swarmed the story, calling it one of the most shocking love scams in years. People were fascinated by how an ordinary businessman could orchestrate such a perfect illusion. The phrase "the husband who rose from the grave" appeared across headlines, while TV anchors replayed images from Raghav's funeral beside footage of him being led in handcuffs into court. For Ananya, the humiliation was unbearable. She became the unwilling face of betrayal, the widow who had buried a stranger. The attention forced her into isolation, haunted by the memory of performing rituals for a man who never died. Raghav's arrest exposed not only his criminal activities, but also the deep network of corruption that had helped him vanish. What began as a love story had turned into a national spectacle, a chilling reminder of how deception can hide behind affection, and how truth can surface when least expected. As the investigation deepened, the police uncovered layers of Raghav's deceit that went far beyond faking his death. Hidden inside their apartment, behind a false panel in the wardrobe, officers found a black briefcase filled with documents, fake passports, and bank statements under multiple identities. Several accounts were traced to foreign banks, showing large transfers made just weeks before his supposed accident. Shockingly, Ananya's name appeared on some of the accounts as a joint holder. At first, she thought it was another cruel mistake, but investigators confirmed that her digital signatures had been used to authorize transactions worth millions of rupees. Raghav had forged her identity, using her as a front to launder money. The discovery placed Ananya under suspicion. She was summoned repeatedly for questioning, forced to recount every detail of her marriage, every document she had ever signed, and every trip Raghav had taken. Her once supportive relatives grew distant, fearing scandal. The same neighbors who had comforted her days earlier now whispered behind her back. Even her in-laws accused her of being complicit, calling her a disgrace to their family. Ananya's world collapsed once again, not because she had lost her husband, but because his sins had tainted her name. Meanwhile, investigators tracked Raghav's communications with several international contacts. He had been planning his escape for months, using coded messages and offshore shell companies to conceal his assets. Every piece of evidence pointed to deliberate manipulation. He had married Ananya not for love, but for convenience. Her clean background, her reputation, and her trust had been tools for his scheme. As Ananya watched the story unfold on television, she realized with horror that her marriage had been nothing more than a carefully constructed illusion designed to hide a criminal empire. In the weeks that followed his arrest, Raghav was subjected to relentless interrogation. Detectives pressed him for details about the fraud, the fake death, and the international connections that had allowed him to move money across borders. At first, he denied everything, claiming it was all a misunderstanding. But as the evidence mounted, bank records, phone logs, and testimony from his associates, his resistance began to crumble. Finally, during one late-night session, Raghav confessed. He admitted that every step of the plan had been his idea. He had built his business on lies, creating fake invoices and phantom shipments to siphon money from investors. When the authorities began tracing the funds, he realized the only way out was to die, at least on paper. In his statement, he claimed he had staged his death to protect Ananya, insisting that he never meant to hurt her. But the evidence told a different story. Investigators found proof that he had transferred nearly 40 lakh rupees into an offshore account registered under a false identity just days before his disappearance. He had purchased a one-way ticket to Singapore, planning to start over under a new name. The notion that he cared for Ananya was another calculated lie meant to evoke sympathy. When Ananya heard of his confession, she felt a strange mix of relief and devastation. There was no comfort in the truth, only the realization that the man she had loved so deeply had never really existed. His affection, his promises, and even his grief over her struggles had all been performances. The final betrayal was not just his deception, but the deliberate way he had used her love as a shield to hide his crimes. The illusion of her marriage was gone forever. Months passed as the case against Raghav moved through the court system, each hearing revealing new details of his deceit. The courtroom became a stage for public fascination, packed with journalists, lawyers, and spectators eager to witness the man who had faked his death. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence: bank records, forged documents, witness statements, and communication logs linking Raghav to a global fraud network. They demonstrated how he had exploited trust, not only from investors, but also from the woman who had stood by him through everything. Ananya attended every session, sitting silently in the back, her expression unreadable. She wasn't there out of anger or love. She was there for closure, determined to face the man who had destroyed her life. During the final hearing, the courtroom fell silent as the judge delivered the verdict. Raghav Sharma was found guilty of financial fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy to manipulate legal documents. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison with no chance of early release. The stolen funds were partially recovered, though a large portion remained untraceable, hidden in offshore accounts that even Raghav refused to reveal. As the sentence was read, Raghav stood calmly, showing no remorse. When his eyes met Ananya's across the room, he gave a faint smile, cold, knowing, and void of regret. That small gesture chilled her more than any words could have. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed as reporters shouted questions, turning the story into a nationwide obsession. The headlines called it India's most twisted love scam, and the world moved on, fascinated by the drama. But for Ananya, there was no sense of victory. Justice had been served, yet the wounds left behind were far deeper than any punishment could heal. In the months following the verdict, Ananya disappeared from public view. The media had turned her tragedy into a spectacle, dissecting every detail of her marriage and portraying her as both victim and symbol of misplaced trust. Unable to bear the constant attention, she left Pune and moved to Bangalore under a different name. There, she rented a small apartment and began working remotely as a freelance designer, determined to rebuild her life from the ashes of her past. She avoided social gatherings, rarely spoke of her history, and deleted every trace of Raghav from her phone and social media. Yet, at night, the memories returned, the sound of his laughter, the warmth of his hand, and the haunting knowledge that none of it had been real. Slowly, she began to heal. Therapy helped her process the layers of betrayal, and work gave her purpose again. She learned to live quietly, cherishing the freedom that had once felt like punishment. Still, certain moments brought the past rushing back. The sight of a man in a crowded market who resembled Raghav, or the echo of a familiar cologne on the street. Each time, her heart would race before reason reminded her he was behind bars. Years later, when a journalist tracked her down for a feature on infamous true crime cases, Ananya refused to appear on camera. She agreed only to share one brief statement. "I buried a man who never existed." Those words summed up everything: the illusion, the betrayal, and the painful rebirth that followed. She had learned that love could blind even the strongest hearts, and that trust, once shattered, could never be fully repaired. The story that had once defined her was now just a memory she chose never to revisit again.